In UniFi Network Controller, if you go to your network settings, for example, for this VLAN 10, scroll to the end under the DHCP service management, you can find a setting called domain name. So in this video, let's talk about what's this domain name for, how you can give it a proper name, how it works from backend perspective, what are the potential issues, and some special scenarios. Okay. First, let's talk about the purpose of this setting. If you move your mouse cursor to the tooltip, you can see Ubiquiti tells you it's just for your browser to access your network. What it really means, let me show you. In this Linux machine, it's within the VLAN 10 you just saw. If I simply type the Linux machine's host name, Debian-10 in the browser search bar, the browser will simply search the word. It's not what I want to do. I want to access the Debian 10 machine's web server. Then let me see if I specifically spell out HTTP. It will work. But what Ubiquiti really means is you don't spell out HTTP. You simply say Debian 10 followed by the domain name we set in the UniFi Network Controller. In my case, it's vlan10.home.arpa. Okay? See, I didn't type HTTP. At the end, the browser visits the web server instead of searching these words. So that's what Ubiquiti means. If you put the domain name at the end, the system will use it as a complete domain name in browser. But in fact, this is just one very special example when it comes to the domain name. In fact, what you are really setting here is a TLD or top level domain. And more specifically, it's a TLD for your private network. We are using some top-level domains every single day, for example, .com, .org. However, when it comes to TLD for private network, there are no international standards. What we have are some proposals. For example, in the RFC 6762 for MDNS, it suggested several domain names for private network. And then in the RFC 8375, it proposed to use home.arpa as the local network domain. Because there are no enforced standards, theoretically you can use whatever names as long as they conform to the naming convention for domain name, right? But in the upper right part, you see some comments regarding the recommended private names. For some names, even though they were recommended sometimes, now you may not want to use them. For example, .corp, .home, because now the TLD has been expanded to include some of these domain names. So if you name your home network with these names, you may have conflicts with the public domain names. And one special example is .local. I do have a video specifically talking about .local domain name. Then go back to UniFi Network Controller setting. Even if you don't have anything configured, internally the system simply treated, okay, you want to have a blank local domain name. Then you lose the control. If you put something, you have the complete control. You don't rely on some random hardware or softwares to add some random domain names. You won't experience some unexpected behavior from some specific softwares, for example, from browser, when it comes to domain name resolution. It is still recommended you use something here. By the way, the local domain name setting is for each individual VLAN. It's not a global setting, which means you can give different network, different VLANs with different domain names. Now let's move on to see how internally it's supported within Ubiquiti's routers and switches. In my lab environment, I have multiple VLANs configured. Let's use VLAN 10 as an example first. As you can see in the network setting, for VLAN 10, the router is the UniFi router, UXG Pro. In the domain name setting, I give it this name. And then in the lower left Linux, let me dig the domain name for this particular Linux. I know this Linux has this host name, then followed by the local domain name I I customized in the UniFi network controller. Let me dig it. It received one answer. See, what's the server? The server is UniFi router's IP address, and the port number is 53, DNS server port number. So the UniFi router is running DNS server to support the VLAN. Then let's use another example. In the networks, I have VLAN 66. You can see for this VLAN, the router is the layer 3 switch. It's not the UniFi router. Let's see for this special VLAN how the domain name is supported. So in the lower right Linux, let me dig this Linux name. By the way, in the domain name, you can see this is the name I gave. See the answer 0, so there's no record found for that domain name from this strange IP address. If you know how Ubiquiti's L3 switch routing works, you may know this is a special IP address for the VLAN 4040. So this IP address is in the router, and apparently for the VLAN 66, the DNS server is not on the switch. Instead, it's running on the router. But for some reason, the local domain name for VLAN 66 doesn't work. So let's go to the backend for the router and the switch to find out what happened. In the UniFi network controller, you can see the router is UX3 Pro and the switch is the 24-port USW Pro. In the lower part, in the left side Linux, let me SSH into the router. And in the right side, let me SSH into the switch. In the router, let me see what processes are listening to port 53, which is for DNS service. What I'm running is netstat Linux command. You can see both TCP and UDP. Let's just look at the UDP ones. As expected, we see the VLAN 1, 10, 20, 30 DNS services, and then we see this strange IP address. As I explained, this is for the VLAN 4040 for the layer 3 switch routing. Yeah, basically that's it. As shown in the diagram, in the UniFi router side, it's running DNS services. If you check the process name, it's DNS mask. DNS mask is very popular and it's free. It's widely used in Linux. It provides DNS and DHCP servers. The UniFi router is running Debian Linux, so it's not surprising that it also uses DNS mask to provide the DNS and the DHCP services. So now we know DNS mask is used, but what are the detailed configurations? Let's look into the configuration files. Go to the run dnsmask.config.d folder. Let's see what's inside. When it comes to DHCP services, it has 4 different configurations for 4 different VLANs. And then for DNS, it has a separate configuration file. Maybe you already noticed it doesn't have DHCP services provided for the layer 3 switch VLAN 66 and 88. Why? Later you will find out they are running in the switch instead of router. Let's double check to make sure DNS mask is running to provide DHCP servers as well. So similarly, let me run the netstat command. This time check the port 67 for DHCP server. So this time it's very simple. It's listening for the request from any clients. And you may think, okay, then it also provides DHCP server for the layer 3 switch VLAN, right? No. Later, we will talk about that. In the VLAN setting for layer 3 switch, when it comes to DHCP, layer 3 switch runs its own DHCP services. So then go back to the DHCP configuration file. Let's pick a random one, for example, the VLAN 10 configuration file to see what's inside. It's very simple. What we are really interested in is this line. See here, it is the local domain name we set in UniFi controller. controller for VLAN 10. And here it also specified it's only for this subnet. If you Google DNS mask configuration example, you can find this file. Then let me search the domain name. It explains what this particular setting is for. First, allow the DHCP host to have FQDN, just like the regular internet domain name. And then the second advantage is you set it once here in the DNS mask configuration, all your system will have the same domain name. Then the third one is not related to our video. It's talking about if you have hosts file, as in Linux, it can automatically expand the domain name. Okay, I believe the DNS mask configuration clearly explained what's the local domain name for. We just checked the DHCP configuration. Now let's see what's inside the DNS configuration. Here it specifies 5 interfaces for VLAN 10, 20, 30, and the BR0 is for the default network. Then here you see the special VLAN 4040 for the layer 3 switch routing. You don't see 66 and 88 because DNS is handled by this special VLAN instead of by VLAN 66 and 88. It clearly confirms that the system is running the DNS mask DNS service for this example VLANs shown in the diagram. At this point, I guess some viewers are already confused. So this video is about DNS domain. Why we keep talking about DHCP service. Even in UniFi network controller, if you go to the local domain name setting, the setting itself is under the DHCP section. What's going on? Why the DNS service is tightly bound with DHCP? Let me explain it using Wireshark. In the lower part of the screen, you can see 2 Linux machines, one from VLAN 10, the other from VLAN 66. From UniFi network controller, you can see VLAN 10 is managed by the UX3 Pro, the router, but VLAN 66 is by the layer 3 switch. Then let's see if we do a DHCP request in these 2 Linux machines, what the differences are. Start from the left one, VLAN 10. Let me start the capturing using Wireshark. You can see I already set the display filter to DHCP. So now let me disconnect from the Ethernet and then reconnect. 2 frames are captured. Let's see what happened. So in the first one, the DHCP request, if we expand the details, you can see it did provide its own host name. It's Debian-10. Then see the acknowledge, the reply from the router. Go to the DHCP details. You can see dozens of options are returned together with the IP address. For example, it has the domain name, which is the topic for this particular video. The DHCP server tells the client machine, okay, this is your domain name. This is what we set in the UniFi network controller for VLAN 10. Another important information or option is the domain name server, the DNS server, is the UniFi router itself. So these 2 options are the ones related to this video. By using these options, the DHCP server informs the client machine what the DNS server is and what's your domain name. Okay, that explains how it works, why the DHCP server and the DNS are related in this video. But remember, we already tested if a VLAN is controlled by the layer 3 switch, the local domain name thing doesn't work. Let's see it again in action using Wireshark. In the same way, let me start capturing, disconnect, reconnect. 2 frames are captured. So the first one is exactly the same as the left one. The client machine tells the DHCP server the host name. So see here is Debian-66-2. But let's see what's in the acknowledge or reply. Expanded. You can see it has less less options. For example, it only has the domain name server. This is the VLAN 4040 gateway in the UniFi router UXG Pro, not from the L3 switch, but you don't see the domain name option. See the left side, we have the domain name option 15. In the right side, we do not have it. So that's why the domain name setting we did in the VLAN 66, it didn't work. We already investigated how the DHCP server works within the UniFi router, right? Then in the right side, let me go to the layer 3 switch. Let's understand how the DHCP server works in the layer 3 switch and why for VLAN 66 and 88 telnet to itself. En for enable config. Let me run the command show IP DHCP global configuration. So you can see the overview about the DHCP services provided by the layer 3 switch. By the way, you can clearly see the way I check the DHCP services are different in the UniFi router and the layer 3 switch, right? The technical reason is for UniFi router and the layer 3 switch, Ubiquiti uses different operating systems. Layer 3 switch inherited from the Edge switch a very good backend command line system. So that's why you have a whole bunch of commands which are not available in the UniFi router. So in UniFi router, you have to rely on the regular Linux commands. Then go back to the layer 3 switch. We see the DHCP overview. Let me check the current DHCP pool. For VLAN 66, what we see the DNS server and then we see the router. We don't see the local domain name. That's why in the Wireshark, you see for VLAN 66, the Linux client didn't get the domain name option back from the DHCP server, right? It's not configured in the layer 3 switch. But in fact, the command line does support the configuration of a local domain name. Let me try it. Let me run this command to configure the DHCP pool for VLAN 66. So then in the available command, you can see I do have the ability to configure the local domain name. Let's try it. Configure the same thing as we set in UniFi network controller, but we already tested. It didn't work. Let me do it here manually. Okay, done. So now let's go back to Wireshark to see whether this time the local domain name works. Okay, I already restarted the Wireshark capturing. Let me repeat. Disconnect. Connect again. Okay, let's see what's the difference in the second frame, the DHCP acknowledge. See, this time we do see the domain name, the option 15, which was not here when we completely rely on the UniFi network controller, right? After we manually configured it using the command line in the layer 3 switch, now we do see this option and it's correctly set as the one we want. It seems problem is resolved. But is that really the case? The answer is very disappointing. In the terminal, let me dig itself. So this is the host name for this Linux client. This is the local domain name, right? If everything works, this dig command should return the answer. But the answer count is 0 from this correct DNS server. It still didn't reply back with the correct IP address. The reason is, even though now the DHCP server correctly gave the client a local domain name, the DNS server itself still doesn't have the information. Why? If you look at the diagram, the DNS server is running using DNS mask on the UniFi router. But what we did, the manual configuration, was simply within this layer 3 switch. So there's some disconnect. They are not working together correctly. If your VLAN is managed by the regular UniFi router, both the DNS server and the DHCP server are running using the same DNS mask within the same machine, the router. They can work together without any problem. But when it comes to the layer 3 switch VLAN, the DHCP server is running in the layer 3 switch. The DNS server is running using DNS mask in the UniFi router. Even though the the layer 3 switch, the DHCP server, does have the ability to provide the local domain name, the DNS server still cannot handle it. My theory is the right side in the UniFi network controller for layer 3 switch VLAN. The local domain name setting, either Ubiquiti forgot to hide it or Ubiquiti forgot to implement it. Anyway, it doesn't work now. I believe we already wasted a lot of time on this layer 3 switch VLAN topic. Let's move on. Before talking about several special scenarios for local domain name, let me briefly mention an interesting finding. So in the router, in the DNS mask configuration folder, there's a file called DNS config, right? So let me display it one more time. If you scroll to the end, you can find several predefined host records, and most of them are about the cloud key. In my lab environment, in the UniFi network controller, you can see I have a cloud key, right? In your config, you may host your own network server, or you may use something like UDM Pro. It has network controller built in, right? No matter what, in the DNS configuration, you can find several host records. The host name are all UniFi, but they have different local domain names. So for each VLAN, it has a unique name, even though their corresponding IP address is the same, the IP address in the default network. So that's interesting. Even though the domain name has the VLAN's domain name, the IP address is not in the VLAN. Yeah, just want to point it out. It's a new finding, at least for me. Next, let's talk about some special scenarios. You know, for a client machine, you can set it to have fixed IP address, which means it may not get the domain name option from the DHCP server. Then whether the whole domain name thing still works. And you may also know there are two different ways to give a client machine a fixed IP address. One, you set it from the client operating system side. Second, you can set it from the UniFi network controller. So let's try both. In the left side Linux client, let me go to the network setting. Under IPv4, let me choose menu, give it fixed IP address, give it a net mask, then the router. When it comes to DNS, let me simulate the DHCP setting, give it the UniFi router's IP address. Okay, that's it. Apply, disconnect, connect again. Let's validate the IP address. It's set to what I want. Let me see whether I can still dig the domain name for this machine. Let me try it. It waited for a pretty long time, did get answer back, and it is from the router. It has the wrong IP address. I believe it's from the cache, just the IP address before I made the manual change. So this test confirms once you have the client-side manual IP address, the local domain name setting in UniFi network controller won't work anymore. Okay? Then in the right side Linux, let me choose another way to set static IP address. Let me go to UniFi network controller and the clients, find this particular Linux machine, go to settings, give it a fixed IP address. So let me say .10.101. Apply changes, and then in the client machine, force the refresh of DHCP. Okay, it's done. Let me see what's the refreshed IP address. Okay, it does have the one I set in UniFi network controller, right? Then let me dig the domain name. This is the domain name it should have. Yep, it immediately replied back with the correct IP address. So that means if you go with this UniFi controller way to give it fixed IP address, yes, your local domain name still works. Okay, so we are done with this special scenario. Move on to the very last topic for this video. In the UniFi network setting, for example, for VLAN 10 under DHCP, you can see the DNS server by default is author. Author means it will assign the the UniFi router's IP address as the DNS server. That works without any problem when it comes to local domain name. But what if you don't like this alter setting? For example, you want to use Google as your DNS server. So whether your local domain name still works. Let's validate it. So before I make this DNS server change, it still has the old UniFi router as the DNS server, right? Then in the lower part, in the two Linux machines from VLAN 10, let me ping the domain name of the default VLAN's Linux client. This is the host name, Debian1. This is the local domain name I gave to the default network in UniFi Network Controller. Let me ping it. Yeah, without any problem, it was successful. Now let me make the DNS server change. Okay, done. Then in the client machine, let me refresh the DHCP setting. Okay, refreshed, ping the same domain name. The name unknown. So because now Google is used to interpret this domain name, of course, it's not valid. How can we resolve this? You may think that's a piece of cake because in UniFi Network Controller under DNS server setting, you can put alternative DNS servers, right? For example, here we can put the UniFi router's IP address here. Then problem resolved, right? Let's see whether it's really the case. Apply changes. In the Linux network, let me disconnect and reconnect, and just to make sure we do have the new DNS server setting. See the two IP address here. It should work, right? Let's validate it. Ping the same domain name, same error. Then if I dig the domain name, you can see the answer count is 0 and the answer is only from Google. The system never tried to use the alternative DNS server. Why is that? So the way how the operating system responds to multiple DNS servers may be different in different operating systems, but at least in Linux, the way it works is the system will try the first DNS server. In our case, the Google one, right? As long as it's not timeout. It doesn't matter whether it resolved the IP address or not, it was successful from name resolving perspective. In our case, the Google server did reply, it's just it didn't find the corresponding IP address, right? So then the system will simply treat this name resolving successful. It never bothered trying the second alternative DNS server, which means our setting is useless. So then you may ask, what's the solution we have? The solution will be related to the so-called DNS forwarding. It's another tough topic for UniFi devices. I may have a dedicated video in the future about UniFi DNS forwarding, but at least in our case, I don't see a easy, straightforward way to achieve that you use external DNS server and you keep the local domain name setting. I don't see an easy way. Okay, this ends the video. It's a long one. Thanks for watching.